So in this video, we're going to talk about alignment, and in particular, we're going to talk about the 9-point alignment system of Advanced Dungeons& and Dragons First Edition. To some extent, this will be applicable to all other versions of Dungeons and Dragons that use the 9-point alignment system, and to a slightly lesser extent than also to the other versions of Dungeons and Dragons, like Original or Basic Expert, that use the 3-point alignment system of law, neutrality, chaos. What we want to do, though, is start off by talking about some ways that Gary Gygax recommended people think about alignment and compare that to kind of the ways that alignment may have been presented in other media by other people, including YouTube today. And then we want to take a look at some ways we can think about alignment not just as a moral map, but as actually an idea that the player or non-player character or even institutionalized things like kingdoms or a secret society might be oriented towards a particular alignment. And then consequently, instead of this vague and abstract concept of morality, what we're actually talking about is defining some factions within the game that are oriented towards these alignments, and subsequently then the player characters can think about themselves as, if not directly aligned with those organizations, that they are at least sympathetic in their alignment with those organizations or forces or factions or however you want to think about it. And then lastly, we're going to go back to something that Gary recommended in several places. It's in the Dungeon Master's Guide, it's in the Player's Handbook, it's in the first article that we'll talk about from the strategic review number 6 that he goes into about law and chaos in the Dungeons and Dragons campaign and their relationship to good and evil. And where he talks about mapping out players or non-player characters or organizations and institutions, but the chart we'll talk about will be specific to players. For you'll have a downloadable PDF that you can use in your own campaigns to kind of map out subtle changes in the way the character or the player plays their character's alignment during the session. And then you can think about that from session to session. If they kind of remain in the same little zone of their professed alignment, then of course you don't think about changing their alignments or imposing any sorts of penalties on them. If you see those subtle shifts start to accumulate over time and you map them out from session to session, you can start to look at different consequences that might have within the narrative of the next or subsequent sessions. I know alignment has fallen out of favor with a lot of contemporary players, and I've made no secret that I think this has a lot to do with a resentment of any type of rule that threatens to impinge on the player's ability to make decisions for their characters in the moment on a session by session basis. I think that as I've said before, people reject any sort of constraint or limitation on choice because they want to be free to do whatever they feel is appropriate in the moment. I think most people would say that they try to be consistent with their character's choices, or that they try and make decisions that comport with what they already know about the shared imagined setting, that are consonant with what they know about that setting. I don't know that that's always the choice, but I don't want to critique that here. What we want to get into is, on the other hand, I also think that alignment has often been represented too rigidly as this sort of heavy handed, narrowly construed, and system of really limiting player choices in ways that go beyond what was ever intended by Gygax, who saw a lot of internal variation being permissible within any particular area of that 9-point alignment system. That they are not rigid categories that only provide a few options for the player to make decisions on their character's behalf. And so we want to start looking at it then not just as a narrowly construed and rigid moral map. But we'll look at an article by John Lees from Dragon Magazine number 60 in 1982 that presents it as more of the law and chaos dimension being personality, and the good and evil axis being sort of what drives you or motivates your character. In its simplest iteration, alignment can be reduced to 4 words. The law and chaos axis is nothing more than order and disorder. The good and evil axis is nothing more than altruism and selfishness. Now, in the 1976 article that Gary Gygax wrote, he listed a number of words that he associated with the particular concepts of law, chaos, good, and evil. And put that on a chart, and put the outer planes on the kind of outer edges of that chart, and then gave the biaxial system of law and chaos and good and evil on the y-axis and law and chaos on the x-axis. And we can go through all those words, and you can kind of read them at your own leisure as we go along, or go back and read the article. It's the Strategic Review number 6 from 1976. But what we want to get at is that there's these concepts that we can apply to it as intensity, variation, and strictness. So the first one is intensity, and part of that goes to these words that we're showing on this, association list with the particular concepts of alignment, and understanding that even in these words there are different levels of intensity that we might associate with the connotative meanings of the words themselves, and that should also be applied to the actual acts of the character within the fictional world that they're playing in. Not all of their acts are going to be of the same intensity, so whether or not they deviate from their professed alignment is something that you consider. But if it's a minor deviation, then you don't immediately go towards changing their alignment or forcing an alignment change on them, or having major penalties handed down from their deity or patron or whomever they're associated with in terms of alignment. You might think in terms of levels of counter deed, but for minor variations, again, Gary Gygax gets very explicitly says that that's not something that in fact he says that movement on the graph is quite possible with regard to campaign participants, and the Dungeon Master should, in fact, make this a standard consideration in play. In other words, expect that from week to week, your characters are not going to be exactly adhering to the professed alignment of the character. And in fact, he kind of goes on in another section of the article to say, if any character did play it utterly consistently, week in, week out, their professed alignment, well, then that's what's going on. If you see in the corners, they have Saint, Godling, Demon, and Devil. Well, they're going towards ascending or descending to the outer planes. I mean, anybody who's that consistent in playing out their alignment is going to go on to the next level of reality, or the next level of existence. And so what we expect from mortal beings is that they're going to vary week in and week out. Now, the other term, or the other place where the variation kicks in, is we'll think about it with in terms of states, or the rulers of states. A state might have an overall alignment orientation, but there's a lot more room for variation within that. And the same could be said for the rulers of states, or even lower levels, the village, the town, the city. They are ruling with a bit more flexibility for all of their constituents or subjects, or whomever is living under them. And so the exactitude with which they'll adhere to the specified alignment given to, whether that's the kingdom or the king or the mayor or whatever, is going to have a lot more variation to it. And then, of course, we get to strictness, where you have to consider how strictly a character should adhere to their professed alignment. So the obvious case that we'll bring up here is the paladin, and the paladin, of course, is in AD&D 1, he has to be a lawful good character, and not only that they have to be within that major quadrant of law and good, but that they're actually relegated to the upper and leftmost quadrant of that quadrant, so that there's a very narrow range of behaviors and decisions that are available to the paladin, because they have to not just be lawful and good, but extremely lawful and good. And Gary Gygax also kind of applies that level of thinking to clerics who profess either a good or an evil alignment, and that they should sort of have to remain in the very uppermost ranges of good or the lowermost ranges of evil consistently. And when they deviate, even if they're not going all the way towards neutrality, that they're starting to move farther than their deity will allow them without some form of repercussions. And so those are the three big categories that we can apply to the kind of application of alignment and the enforcement of rules on alignment over character choices that go from session to session over the course of a campaign. Intensity, variation, strictness. And we see neutrality being the most narrowly construed in the middle, and that's something that Gary even says in the Dungeon Master's Guide and the description for neutrality. And there, I think, is a case where I play neutral a lot more strictly or actively than I think most people do. I think a lot of people have used neutrality as if you don't want to kind of get your character involved in alignment, just be neutral, and the attitude will be, well, it all works itself out in the end. Whereas I see, and Gary does refer to this in several places, in particularly the definition for neutrality given in the Dungeon Master's Guide, where he's talking about if the character may not do much to act as long as they don't see a major imbalance occurring. If they perceive something is causing an imbalance, then they should be expected to act to correct that imbalance. And by the same token, if a character is lawful and good, they shouldn't be given a lot of latitude to overlook the behaviors of a character who is chaotic and evil. In other words, they can't just pretend not to notice the bad decisions that other character is making, at least from their perspective. And so that's a level of strictness as well. We also kind of then will go on to this next slide and look at all these creatures then can be placed on that same diagram, as this applies to players, non-player characters, and monsters alike. And, Gary is very careful to specify that the placement of the creatures on the chart that is printed in the Strategic Review article reflects his ethos as a writer to some extent, or his ethos as a person to some extent. And that you will place your monsters and players and non-player characters somewhat differently perhaps than he would. The idea is be consistent to your definitions and your created worlds, and not worry so much about exactly adhering to what's given as the so-called definition of that particular alignment, whether that's in the Player's Handbook or the DM's Guide or wherever else. And that applies to a lot of things. In fact, the kind of the Law Schick article gets into various kinds of factions, and this is what I would say. Don't think of alignment as this moral map that your characters and your kingdoms are all bound to in this very narrowly construed way. Law Schick actually, I don't want to get into all the categories he used because I don't necessarily agree with the way he defined things that are somewhat problematic, like his understanding of evolution is pretty wrong. And but he did, he's just going into law neutrality and chaos. And he said even within law there's different types of law. There's the law of absolute order, there's law expressed as harmony between all things, there's law expressed as absolute knowledge. So the more deeply you understand all things, that's part of law. He also mentions that war, in terms of, can be either law or chaos. I think what he's getting at there is kind of military science is lawful in its approach, but the actual conduct of battles within wars is pretty chaotic. And then in neutrality, he mentions preserving the balance, but then also nature or the four elements might be examples of neutral factions with which one could be aligned. And he gets off into chaos as well, but absolute randomness is the best one. And of course, the war is an example where there's a chaotic side or a lawful side. He also mentions things like ambition and life and fertility as part of the chaos side too. So it's not always clear, but I think the idea is sound in the sense that don't think that you just have to have one faction for each alignment, and that if you're of that alignment, you have to be aligned to that particular faction or that particular deity. Because again, and this is something that comes out of the article by John Lees, an alignment is not a religion. A religion could certainly adhere to a particular alignment. The deity at the head of that, or that is the focal point of that religion, could certainly be of a particular alignment or have an expectation of particular alignment from its worshippers. But the alignment itself is not then to be considered a religion in and of itself. And kind of the Lees article gets into talking about the difference between an ethic, a moral, and a law. And just to cover it real quickly, if it helps kind of categorize these things for yourself, what he's saying is an ethic is sort of a simple statement of things that you think are the right way to go. So we might think of an example as being do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that ethic then is a statement of a moral. And the moral there is that we might think of it as we believe the right thing to do is to treat others with the same level of respect that we treat ourselves. And then if we were to write laws that enforced that amongst the civil society in which we were living, that would be writing morals into law. But he also brings up the point that laws are often an expression of a norm, a mores, a moral. But when they are not an expression of a moral, they are notoriously difficult to enforce. So we might think that the laws that are most enforceable or most frequently enforced by the agents of power that we have in our game worlds will be the ones that are connected with this sort of moral, and an ethic then is sort of a simpler representation of the moral that it represents. And then we're going to go back into, I think I'll just skip over to a live video again for a minute, and we'll look at filling out this downloadable form that kind of reflects the same type of form that Gary presented in his 1976 article. All right, so then for this last brief section, let's take a look at this form that I developed that you can download from the description section of this video, and you can use it then to track variation and shifts in individual character alignment from session to session over the course of a campaign. And we'll kind of mention just briefly, if you talk about the John Lee's article, and that we talked about good and evil being the axis that sort of represents the motivations of a character, whether they're in it for the well-being of all the goodly creatures or just in it for themselves, and that law and chaos then was sort of a measure of personality. Now that might be overly simplistic, but then you could at least think about that in terms of whether they'll be more inclined to join in with and act on behalf of a group, or if they were, regardless of how they feel about the well-being of the goodly creatures or being in it for their own self-interest, that they would tend to prefer to work alone and maybe only temporarily or briefly work with others. And then, so just to talk about the form and going back to the way that this is based on Gary Gygax's chart from his 1976 article about law and chaos and the relationship to good and evil in the D&D campaign. The idea would be that you would start the character in the middle, at the very beginning of the very first session of whatever their professed alignment is, and that you would, over the course of time, keep track of where they went. So we'll track it a little bit. Let's just say that at the beginning, top of the form here, what we have is character name, player name, class of the character, their level, and then you can list them out, some affiliations. So again, that might be the religion that they're involved in. It might be some sort of organization or society in which they're involved, but that at least tells you a little bit about what alignments you should expect from them. And then we have a box for strict. So, paladin or a good or evil cleric might be a case where you're using it strict. And you might, if they're on the cusp of having an alignment change posed on them, or if there are some sort of corrective counter deeds that are expected or have been intimated to them that they should probably think about doing some counter deeds to correct some flaws in their adherence to their professed alignment, then you can tick that box. But then the rest of it, of course, would be, like with paladins, they are up in this very uppermost left-hand corner. And I didn't put the X in the middle like Gary did. I vary the formings. I have my own sort of graphic for the center and everything. But over time, if they're moving towards the extremes of their professed alignment, then they would move towards the outer edge. If they're moving in towards neutrality, then they'd move in towards the center of the diagram. Now, on the other side, my usual diagram or mapping space, if you want to kind of do a flow chart or something like that to express changes in their alignment. But per session, then you will record a session number, the date on which it was played, and the in-game times that you started and ended that particular session. So that's probably going to be different than one day or one segment of 4 hours or 3 hours, whatever you play with. So you can go back to, presumably you're keeping a log of your campaign, so you can go ahead and match those in-game dates back to what was going on in the logbook. But each time there's a session, then you might write 1, 2, 3 on that. So then on the other side, let's say we have a chaotic good elf who's just come out of the forest and joined up with the party. We would start off here. That would be number 1. And then let's say they do some things, like they join up with the party is one thing that's sort of nudging them towards law. We'll say it was not much shift away, maybe one little step towards law. And that would be, part of, as they commit to the party, let's say that's where they go with the second one. But then let's say the next time they go off and do their own thing during the adventure, and so now we've taken another step in chaos. So by the third session, they're mapping in a slightly different spot, but they're still all well within chaotic good. They're making decisions that are more or less chaotic, more or less lawful, more or less good, more or less evil. And every time they make a small shift, and then we go back to intensity, a big jump might take you all the way into the next quadrant, or you might map out little jumps as being all within the same cluster where the cross is in the center of the graphic. And it's really just that simple. I also put a little box over here for their professed alignment, and of course if something happened where they kind of exceeded the tolerances of that professed alignment and had an alignment change forced upon them, or made a decision to do it, you could change your alignment up in that box. Anyway, that was it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. No, it wasn't very much of a moving picture, but I hope you get some use out of the form, or that you at least kind of want to take an interest in tracking alignment. This is something that Gary says in several places. It's in the DM's guide, in the section about alignment. It's in the player's handbook, and it's in that strategic review article that you might want to consider tracking variation and alignment from session to session for all of your players. So it's definitely something that was there at the very beginning of the game. Anyway, that was it for today, and I thank you very much, and I hope to see you again at the next one.